Long before I ever grew old enough to drive a car or buy my own ticket out of the mountains, a single winter night carved itself into the grain of my memory like the scar on a weathered pine. I was 10, my sister Anya was 7, and our baby brother slept safe next door in Frau Weber's warm cottage. Our parents worked late that evening, trusting the familiar quiet of our Tyrolean village. The air outside held that clean, biting cold that only deep Alpine winters can keep. We'd grown up with the rhythm of snowstorms and the lullaby of wind off the ridges, so a night alone in our wooden chalet wasn't supposed to be anything more than ordinary. But the night that followed became a legend inside me, one that would haunt my sleep for years. The fire had burned down to a red hush in the stone hearth. I remember the soft crackle of melting logs, the hiss of a gust brushing the shutters, and Anya humming some silly tune while coloring at the kitchen table. Our mother's handwritten note sat by the breadbasket. Back by midnight. Keep the door locked. We'd read it twice, mostly for comfort. I felt proud of the responsibility, 10 years old and trusted. The snow piled thick against the porch rail, moonlight sharpening the drifts into silver ridges. I pressed my palm to the window pane. The glass was a sheet of ice. At 9:30, the first knock came. Sharp. Not a neighborly tap, but the kind that snapped through the wood. Anya startled, her crayon streaking a jagged line across her drawing. My heart kicked once, hard. We weren't expecting anyone. I crossed to the door, standing on tiptoe to peer through the small diamond window. A man stood there, a dark figure against the snow, his coat dusted white, hair damp and sticking to his forehead. He looked to be in his 40s, with eyes that caught the porch light like wet stones. He smiled, a slow, practiced curve of the lips. "Hello," he said through the door, voice steady but carrying a strange urgency. "I know your father, Klaus, and your late grandfather. May I wait inside for your mother?" Anya edged beside me, her small hand clutching my sleeve. Something in his voice, polite yet pressing, set a prickling along my neck. I managed a wavering, "Our parents aren't home." "That's fine," he said quickly. "I'll just wait by the fire. It's bitter out here." The wind whipped between the eaves. Snow spiraled across the porch. His breath misted in the cold, but he didn't shiver. My fingers tightened on the door handle without turning it. Mother's note burned in my mind. "Keep the door locked." Then the phone rang. The old wall phone's bell jarred the silence. I snatched it up. "Leo!" Sophie's whisper came quick, frightened. "My mom just saw a man looking in windows down the lane, dark coat, messy hair. Don't open the door." I turned back. The man was still there, watching, smile unchanged. My breath caught. "Anya," I said, voice thin. "Coats. Now." We didn't argue. We grabbed our jackets and boots from the bench, hands clumsy. The second knock was slower, heavier. We backed toward the hallway, hearts thundering. Upstairs, the bedroom window groaned under my push, the frame stiff with frost. The night air hit us like a blade. We scrambled onto the roof edge and slid down the snowbank, plunging knee-deep into icy powder. Behind us, the chalet loomed dark and silent. The man's shadow moved on the porch, but we didn't look back again. We ran. The wind flayed our cheeks, our breath coming in ragged bursts. The village path stretched white and endless under the moon. Anya stumbled and I pulled her up, whispering that we were almost there, almost safe. Sophie's house glowed warm in the distance like a single lantern against the black mountain walls. Sophie's mother opened the door before we could knock. We tumbled inside, breathless and shaking, snow melting in messy puddles on the wood floor. Her father grabbed the phone, dialing the police with clipped urgency. Sophie's eyes were wide, darting from me to Anya. "He was right there," I managed. "At our door." Her mother pressed blankets around our shoulders, murmuring words that barely reached through the pounding in my ears. In the warmth of their living room, the fear in my chest didn't soften. It sharpened. Every creak outside felt like footsteps. The mountain wind howled against the shutters as if it carried the man's voice. Minutes stretched like hours until headlights cut across the yard. Two officers, coats heavy with snow, stepped inside. Their radios hissed. They questioned us gently, their eyes flicking toward the dark path to our chalet. One officer spoke into his radio, and the other reassured Anya, but I caught the unease in their faces. They headed out, flashlights slicing through the swirling flakes. When they returned, their boots thick with fresh snow, they shook their heads. No man, no footprints leading away. Only our own frantic trail in the drifts. The officers promised patrols and a careful watch, but their words felt thin against the empty night. Hours later, my parents arrived, faces tight with worry. Mother knelt, her arms a trembling fortress around us. Father's jaw was clenched hard as the ice outside. The officers spoke quietly with them, their voices low. I thought of the man's eyes, wet stones catching the porch light, and of how he never shivered. That night, even surrounded by warmth, I lay awake, listening for the sound of that knock in every groan of the old chalet timbers. The mountain silence, once my cradle, had turned into something else. A hollow echo, waiting to be broken again. Morning came pale and brittle, sunlight washing the peaks in a thin gold that carried no warmth. I had slept little, my body jerking awake at every sigh of the rafters. When Father returned from speaking with the officers, his face was drawn tight. Mother set a pot of coffee on the stove, her movements stiff, the steam curling like restless ghosts. They searched again at first light, Father said, rubbing his temples. Fresh snow, no tracks, no sign of him. His voice held that controlled weight grown-ups use when they're trying to keep children calm. It fooled neither of us. Anya sat beside me at the kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a mug of warm milk. He said he knew Grandfather, she whispered. But Grandfather died before I was born. Mother looked away quickly, her eyes flashing something I could not name. Eat your breakfast, she said, but the toast cooled untouched. Later that day, the officers showed us a grainy print from a roadside camera. It was past 4 a.m, hours after we had fled. The man was inside our chalet. The picture caught only his back, a hunched silhouette in the flickering glow of the hearth. He faced the empty living room, head tilted as if listening. The officers couldn't explain how he'd gotten in. The doors were still locked when they arrived. I felt a strange chill crawl up my arms. I imagined him standing in our home while we huddled safe at Sophie's, his breath fogging the cold air, his gaze wandering over the toys, the photographs, the note our mother left. The idea that he could know us without ever being known in return was more terrifying than the knock itself. That afternoon, Mother revealed something she had kept quiet. 2 days ago, she said, her voice low, a man approached me in the square. He said things about our family, about your grandfather's favorite hunting spots, details no stranger could know. I told him I didn't recognize him, but he smiled and walked away. I should have told the police then. Father's jaw tightened. You couldn't have known. But the words felt like a door slammed on questions we were too young to ask. For weeks, patrols swept the village. Neighbors double-locked doors. Frau Weber kept our baby brother close. Yet the man never appeared again. The winter crept on, burying the paths in deeper snow, and the world returned to a fragile normal. But at night, when the wind scraped against the shutters, I heard the echo of his knock and the soft hiss of the fire that had burned behind him, years blurred. Childhood hardened into memory, school books into exams, and finally the restless pull of leaving home. By 18, I stood taller than Father, my voice a stranger's in my own mouth. Yet that night followed me like a scent carried on a mountain draft. I'd wake some morning certain I'd heard that same sharp knock, though the city outside my window buzzed with traffic instead of Alpine silence. During a summer visit home, I walked the old path at dusk. The chalet, freshly painted, stood quiet against the fading sky. Snow no longer lined the porch. Wildflowers pushed through the grass where our frantic footprints once marked the drifts. I traced a hand over the door frame and felt the memory pulse like a second heartbeat. Anya joined me, now a teenager, her hair caught in the breeze. "Do you ever wonder what he wanted?" she asked. "Every time I think about it," I said. She nodded, eyes distant. I still hear that knock. We stood together in the twilight, listening to the mountain wind. It carried the same cold hush as years before, but now I understood how easily silence could hide danger. Later, as we sat by the fire, Mother spoke gently of the village's long memory, of how strangers sometimes drift through mountains, leaving only questions behind. "But you were brave," she told us. "You trusted your instincts. That's what kept you safe." I thought of Sophie's late-night call, of Anya's hand gripping mine as we ran through knee-deep snow. I thought of the man who knew our names without ours for him. Some mysteries never unfold. But the lesson had already taken root. Life has a way of dressing danger in familiar clothing, polite words, a practiced smile, the claim of friendship. That night taught me the worth of listening to the quiet alarm inside, the one that needs no proof to speak the truth. And so the moral remains. When unease stirs in your bones, trust it. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of heeding it, even when no one else yet sees the shadow on the snow. I never liked being alone. At 17, I thought I was grown enough to handle it. My parents leaving me behind at the family cabin on Giski seemed like a trivial test of independence. But that night, curled up with my sketchbook beside the floor-to-ceiling window, the windswept island revealed just how thin the line was between solitude and something else, something harder to define. The cabin, a glass-walled cube perched at the edge of jagged cliffs, always felt like it belonged more to the sea than to us. My parents had ferried off earlier in the evening to check on my aunt, leaving me with a modest dinner and a lingering sense of guilt for not volunteering to go along. I tried to fill the quiet with pencil strokes, sketching the harbor under the full moon. The water gleamed silver, the boats like sleeping toys in the harbor basin. I was lost in detail, the ripple of the water, the foam along the rocks, when a sudden flicker drew my eyes up. A beam of light cut across the room, sharp and deliberate. At first I thought it was a trick of the moon reflecting off the wet glass, but the motion was intentional, a slow, rhythmic sweep. I froze. Through the mist, I glimpsed a figure at the water's edge. Hood pulled low, flashlight angled toward the cabin. It wasn't moving in any pattern I recognized, but it was too controlled to be accidental. I opened the sliding door, my voice trembling. "Hello? Are you okay?" The light died instantly and the figure vanished into the fog. My heart stuttered. I leaned out, scanning the rocky shore. Nothing. Only the sound of waves breaking and the distant cry of a gull. I backed inside, slammed the door and locked it, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. Moments later, the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. Not the usual groan of old wood, but deliberate, slow steps circling the cabin. I pressed my ear to the glass, the pulse of my own heartbeat nearly drowning out the rhythm of someone, or something, moving outside. I grabbed my phone, but the signal flickered like a dying candle. I couldn't call for help. Panic began its slow crawl through my chest. Then, a thud against the back door made me jump, followed by an eerie silence. Minutes dragged into an hour. I couldn't tell whether I was imagining sounds now or if they were real, but the mist outside held a menace I couldn't shake. Finally, through the fog, I spotted the faint glow of my father's boat. Relief washed over me in tidal waves, but it was tinged with a fear I couldn't explain. Damp footprints looped around the cabin and scratch marks marred the lock plate on the rear door. The police were sympathetic but evasive. "You're not the first to report something like this," one officer said. "People see lights along the shore. Someone signaling maybe, but we never find anyone." They suggested it could have been fishermen, pranksters, or just the fog playing tricks. I didn't buy it. The figure had been deliberate, patient, watching. I could still feel it in my chest, a quiet accusation I couldn't name. That night changed the way I saw the cabin. I no longer felt the freedom of glass walls and open views. Instead, I felt exposed, as though the sea itself could reach in and watch. I tried to keep drawing to convince myself that the pencil in my hand was armor, but every shadow flickering across the harbor made me glance over my shoulder. By the next weekend, the memory had hardened into a quiet obsession. I walked the paths around the cliffs, retracing the shoreline, trying to understand what had happened. The villagers were polite but tight-lipped. Old fishermen muttered about lights in the fog and people disappearing into the night, but no one gave details. I became aware of a rhythm in the island itself. The wind through the rocks sounded like footsteps. The waves crashing against the cliffs sounded like knocks on doors. Even during the day, I felt eyes on me. When I asked a local boy about the flashlight people, he shrugged. "They say it's the fog playing tricks," he said, voice low, as though saying it louder would make it real. "Or maybe someone's just testing you. Everyone who lives here knows to watch." Testing me. The words echoed in my head. And that's exactly what it had felt like. Someone measuring my fear, watching to see how far I could be pushed before panic became action. I tried to sleep, tried to tell myself it was nothing, but each time the fog rolled in, I felt the pulse of the light, slow and deliberate, across the window of my mind. By the time my parents returned, I had developed a ritual. Check every lock, watch the horizon, keep the pencil moving. Sketching was safety, a tether to the world outside that strange, silent danger. The cabin was still beautiful, the harbor still breathtaking, but the peace had shifted. And I had learned, without anyone saying it aloud, that the island had rules I didn't yet understand, and the light had taught me to respect them. The days after that first night felt almost normal. My parents were careful to check in constantly, their calls a lifeline. But the island has its own rhythm, and I quickly learned that being alone on Giski was not just about solitude, it was about awareness. Every gust of wind, every shifting shadow seemed to carry a meaning. One morning, I decided to walk down to the northern cliffs. The harbor lay quiet under a gray sky, boats bobbing in shallow water. I traced the path along the rocks, scanning for footprints. I wanted evidence, proof that the hooded figure wasn't just a trick of fear. And then I saw them, faint prints in the wet sand, small and deliberate, curving back toward the forest line. I followed them cautiously. The prints disappeared abruptly at a tangle of driftwood. My heart raced, not with fear this time, but with determination. Someone had been there. Someone had watched. I spent the afternoon questioning villagers, trying to piece together any story, any warning. They were polite but tight-lipped. A retired fisherman named Lars finally spoke, voice low. "They come when the fog is thick. Watchers. Not dangerous, but curious. They test who's awake, who's paying attention." "Watchers?" I repeated, confused. He nodded, staring out at the harbor. "Some say it's old traditions, spirits of the sea, or maybe people who live by the tides and the rocks. You can't argue with them. You respect them or they test harder." I left his house with a shiver. That night, I lay in bed listening. The wind howled, and somewhere beyond the cliff edge I thought I heard footsteps. My door rattled slightly. I didn't panic. I waited. Eventually the sound faded. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts. A week later the fog returned, thick and heavy. I was sketching again, pencil in hand, when a sudden movement caught my eye. The beam of a flashlight sliced across the cabin wall. Not a flicker this time. It was steady, deliberate. My pulse quickened, but I remembered Lars's words. Observation, not reaction. I waited. The figure remained at the edge of the rocks, motionless. I watched the light dance across the mist. After a few tense minutes, I realized the figure wasn't approaching. It was testing, yes, but respecting boundaries. Slowly, I picked up a notebook and held it to the window. I sketched the beam of light, the mist, the shadowy figure at the edge of the rocks. A silent dialogue, a recognition. Then, As suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The weeks that followed were quieter. I began to feel a strange connection with the island, its rhythms, and the unseen presence that had once terrified me. I understood that fear alone doesn't define danger. Respect and awareness do. I started hiking alone, sketching constantly, learning to read the signs in the wind, the rocks, and the waves. The island, which had once seemed hostile and threatening, became a teacher. Years later, I still returned to Giska. The cabin is smaller in my memory, the cliffs more jagged, the fog more mysterious. I've grown used to the uncertainty, and the sketches I fill are a record not of fear, but of vigilance. Sometimes, when the mist thickens and a stray beam of light flickers across my window, I pause. I don't panic. I acknowledge it, and I continue. I never saw the hooded figure again, nor did anyone ever explain the strange signals along the shore. But I learned something profound. The world has its own boundaries, its own silent guardians, and wisdom often arrives through caution. That night, alone and frightened, had taught me patience, observation, and respect for forces larger than myself. The island, the fog, and the light were a lesson in subtlety. It reminded me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act wisely in its presence. Some lessons don't arrive in words. They arrive in moments of quiet when fear confronts you and you respond not with panic but with attention, respect, and calm. And so I sketch, and I watch, and I remember that the world, like Giski in the mist, is often stranger and more patient than we are. Those who move through it recklessly may stumble. Those who move with care may learn. Respect the unseen, heed the signs, and never underestimate the quiet tests life places in your path. That was the moral I carry with me now. Vigilance tempered with calm and courage measured in quiet observation. I had always loved the solitude of the old Victorian house in Whitstable. Its tall, narrow windows overlooked the gray North Sea, and the salty wind seemed to whisper stories through the cracks in the weathered wood. My parents were heading to London for a gala, leaving me, 19, with the freedom to roam the house alone for the night. It sounded like a perfect plan, until it wasn't. The evening had started simply enough. I'd taken a long shower, letting the steam cling to the antique mirrors in the upstairs bathroom, tracing little patterns as I caught my reflection. I was alone, or so I thought. Then I heard it, a metallic click, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the hum of the gale rattling the sash windows. My pulse jumped. I wrapped a towel around my waist and crept to the landing. The front door was ajar, the cold wind curling in around the edges, bringing with it the tang of salt and seaweed. "Riley?" I whispered, calling our Labrador. The house remained silent except for the occasional groan of wood under the wind's push. I thought about confronting whoever, or whatever it was, but instinct won over courage. I ducked back into my bedroom and quietly turned the brass key in the lock, listening. Footsteps shuffled in the hallway. The cellar door groaned as if it were being wrestled open, the iron latch clanging against the stone. Something heavy scraped across the floor. My hand trembled on the phone as I dialed 999, forcing calm into my voice, explaining to the operator that someone was inside. The intruder moved upstairs, toward my room. The knob rattled once, then twice, before stilling. Through the roar of the wind, sirens approached in the distance. A slam from the front door made me jump. The wind carried the echo across the empty halls. When the police arrived, they traced the steps to the cellar and the back door, both signs of forced entry, but found nothing missing. The footprints led down to the beach and disappeared beneath the tide, leaving a sense of unfinished business that gnawed at me. Days later, I noticed the coal chute in the cellar had been unbolted from the inside, like a silent invitation left open for a return. Since that night, I've never taken a shower without locking the door behind me. Even now, whenever I hear a metallic click or a shift in the wind, a part of me braces for the past to creep back in. That night taught me the fragility of safety. and how quickly solitude can turn into something terrifying. In the days that followed, Whitstable seemed smaller, more intimate, yet eerily menacing. I couldn't sleep in my own bed, the darkness feeling heavier than the fog rolling off the beach. Riley, usually my shadow, sensed it too. The Labrador stayed glued to my side, growling at corners that should have been empty. I spoke to my parents about it once they returned. Maybe it was just a kid messing around, my father suggested over tea, trying to reassure me. But I had no doubts. Whoever it was had a plan, had moved with intent, and had left a trail that felt more like a message than an accident. The neighborhood, usually quiet, seemed to shift. Windows glinted as I walked past, neighbors peeking from behind curtains. I started checking locks obsessively, learning each creak and draft in the house. The cellar became a place I avoided, though curiosity gnawed at me. Why had someone unbolted that coal chute? Why hadn't they stolen anything? One afternoon I tried to distract myself. I walked along the beach, staring at the tide's constant motion. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, until I spotted faint footprints etched in the sand. My stomach dropped. The same size and spacing as those from the night of the break-in. The wind had partially erased them, yet the shape was unmistakable. My mind raced. Was it someone following me, waiting for the house to be empty again? I began documenting every odd sound, every flicker of shadow. I would hear chairs shift in the living room when I knew I was alone. Doors that had been closed mysteriously opened. I even installed a few cameras, though I didn't tell my parents. The footage captured little, a hallway empty in the glow of infrared, shadows playing tricks on the lens, the faint hum of the wind. But sometimes in a corner, a figure seemed to linger, a silhouette vanishing as soon as I blinked. Riley's behavior changed. He would bark at empty rooms, sit growling at doors, and pace when I paced. My friends called me paranoid. "It's just an old house, Marcus," they said. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But I knew the truth. That night had left a mark, a silent understanding that the house wasn't mine alone. I started sleeping with a baseball bat under the pillow, my phone always within reach. Every time the wind rattled the windows, I remembered the metallic click, the cellar door, the scrape across the floor. The memory was alive, pulsing in the corners of my mind, a warning that solitude came with a price. And yet life had to continue. School, friends, normal conversations, each a fragile layer masking the unease lurking beneath. But I couldn't shake the thought that someone, or something, had tested the boundaries of my life, and I had barely survived the inspection. By mid-December, the house felt less like a home and more like a cage. I had grown hyper-aware of every sound, the groan of floorboards, the rattle of the windows, the wind slapping against the eaves. Riley refused to leave my side, his dark eyes scanning every shadow. My parents had noticed my obsession and tried to calm me. "You can't live like this forever, Marcus," my mother said gently, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "The house isn't dangerous. It's just old." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't. That night, alone in the living room with the fireplace crackling, I saw it again. A shadow crossed the hall, quick and deliberate, vanishing when I blinked. My throat tightened. I whispered, "Who's there?" But only the wind answered, rattling the sash window. Determined to confront the fear, I decided to investigate the cellar thoroughly. The iron latch had been fixed, but I moved carefully, inspecting every corner. Dust stirred in the faint light, and the smell of damp coal hung heavy. Then I noticed something unusual. Faint scratches along the wall near the coal chute. They were subtle but deliberate, not the kind of marks that decay alone would leave. I took photos with my phone, feeling the hair on my neck stand on end. Riley growled low, tail stiff. I called my friend Sam for advice. "Marcus, maybe you're overthinking this," he said, half laughing. "Old houses creak, shadows shift, it's nothing." "It's not nothing, Sam," I insisted. "I know what I saw. And the chute. Someone unbolted it intentionally. They want to come back." He sighed. "Be careful." Don't go wandering around the house in the dark, just lock up and stay put. That night I double-checked every lock, every window. I left the cellar light on, hoping it would deter whoever had been inside. Hours later, a sound woke me. A faint metallic click so precise it made my stomach twist. Riley barked, a sharp, warning bark. I grabbed my bat and phone, creeping toward the stairs. The front door rattled as though pushed by a force stronger than the wind. My heart raced. I called 999, but the line was dead. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. Whoever it was wasn't here for theft. They were testing boundaries, probing weaknesses. I retreated upstairs and locked myself in my room, listening to the heavy silence that followed. By morning, the house was still. The tide had erased any traces on the sand. But I knew. I had survived a warning, and next time, I might not be so lucky. Christmas approached, and the town's lights did little to soothe the tension I carried. I kept the house locked, lights on, and Riley by my side. I noticed patterns in the disturbances, always when the wind picked up, always at night. I began keeping a journal. Sounds, shadows, door movements. It was obsessive, yes, but I needed to regain control. One evening, my curiosity overpowered caution. I climbed down to the cellar with a flashlight. I traced the scratches on the wall again, careful not to disturb anything. Then I noticed footprints. Small, neat, and oddly deliberate, leading to the coal chute. My breath caught. They weren't recent, but they hadn't been washed away by the last tide either. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. A cold draft rushed past me, carrying the metallic scent of rust and seawater. I froze. A voice, soft but distinct, echoed from the chute. "Marcus." I spun around. Riley growled, hackles raised, but the hallway was empty. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible, yet my instincts told me otherwise. I bolted upstairs, heart hammering. I spent the night planning. A system of locks, cameras, even setting traps in the cellar to alert me to any entry. I refused to let fear control me, but I had to respect it, understand it, anticipate it. Whoever had been in my house wasn't a random thief. They were methodical, patient, and silent, and I had to match that focus. By New Year's Eve, I had transformed the house into a fortress, and yet, the unease lingered. Every shadow, every creak, reminded me of the night the intruder first entered. The metallic click haunted me, not as a sound, but as a symbol of vulnerability, a lesson I couldn't ignore. Winter faded, and spring arrived with reluctant warmth. I began to reclaim the house, bit by bit, replacing fear with knowledge. I had learned every creak, every draft, every nook where a shadow could linger. Riley became my constant ally, a living alarm system, and my vigilance sharpened to a fine edge. One evening, as I cleared the cellar, I noticed the coal chute was back in place, bolts tightened. For the first time, I didn't feel fear, just a cautious sense of closure. Whoever had intruded had left, intentionally or otherwise, and I had endured. The lessons of that night and the weeks after were ingrained in me. I realized the intruder had forced me to see the fragility of safety, the vigilance required to protect oneself, and the resilience needed to face fear without letting it dominate life. That house, the wind, the shadowy figure, they were no longer enemies but teachers. I never discovered who it was or why they had come, but the experience left me stronger, more aware, and surprisingly patient. I still locked doors, checked windows, and listened closely when the wind whistled through the eaves, but now it was with respect, not terror. And as the tide washed the beach clean each day, I understood something essential. Fear is unavoidable, but courage, vigilance, and careful observation are what keep us safe. I had faced the unknown, endured its test, and learned that true security comes from preparation, awareness, and respect for the world's unpredictability. The moral, I realized, was simple. Life will always present threats, seen or unseen, but the strength to endure, to adapt, and to remain alert is what truly defines safety. The house in Whitstable remained my home, a constant reminder that vigilance paired with resilience is the best defense against fear. I never thought a drizzly October night in the Yorkshire Dales would feel like the beginning of anything more than a long, damp evening. The stone cottage my family had owned for generations sat perched on the edge of a moor, its gray walls blending into the low-hanging mist. At 14, I had always loved the isolation, the quiet moments where it felt like the wind and the hills themselves were my only companions. My parents had driven off to a late community meeting, leaving me alone with nothing but a stack of homework, a horror novel, and the low crackle of the fireplace. I had just sunk into the overstuffed armchair, letting the plot of my book pull me in, when it started. A thud. Faint at first, almost easy to ignore. I froze, listening. The fire hissed and popped, the rain drummed on the roof, and then another sound. Heavier this time, deliberate. A scrape along the loft boards. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was the wind, the old cottage settling. But the sound didn't feel accidental. I put down the book and moved toward the narrow staircase leading up to the attic. My hand gripped the smooth brass handle of the lantern I had carried up for emergencies, and I climbed slowly, every creak of the floorboard sounding alarmingly loud. When I reached the hatch, I paused, breath held. The cover shuddered as though something had pressed against it, then opened just an inch. And then I saw it. A pale hand, skinny and pale in the dim lantern light, gripped the edge before disappearing back into the darkness. My stomach sank, and I stumbled backward, landing softly against the wall. My mind raced. The loft was supposed to be empty. My parents had warned me to stay away from it. I backed down the stairs, careful not to let the old boards betray my retreat. Once I reached the sitting room, I grabbed the landline and whispered into the receiver, explaining what I'd seen. I dragged a chair beneath the back door handle and pressed my back against the wall, listening. Minutes stretched, each one longer than the last. Then, blue lights splashed across the foggy windows, followed by the sharp sound of the door bursting open. Officers filled the small room, flashlights cutting through the dim interior. They searched the cottage and found nothing unusual at first, just the usual collection of dust, old books, and furniture. But then one of them spotted it. Behind a rafter in the loft lay a rolled-up sleeping bag, scattered food wrappers, and a soot-stained lantern, still warm. Someone had been living in our attic, slipping in and out through the hayloft hatch that my parents rarely latched. Even as my parents arrived, frantic and bewildered, I kept hearing faint, impossible sounds overhead. Every creak of the ceiling made me glance upward. Every shadow seemed to move just beyond the firelight. That night, I understood for the first time how the mind of a 14-year-old could make a familiar house feel like a trap, like something alive and watching. The days after the discovery were strange. My parents insisted that the police had thoroughly searched the area and that whoever had been in our loft was gone for good. I wanted to believe them, but something in me refused. I began checking the locks obsessively, peering into the rafters whenever I climbed the narrow staircase. The cottage felt different somehow, heavier. The walls seemed to hold secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. School provided some distraction. I told a few friends about the incident, but their reactions, half laughs, half rolled eyes, only made me feel more isolated. I stopped mentioning it, fearing they'd think I was imagining things. But when I was home alone, the quiet settled in with a weight I couldn't shake. Sometimes I'd hear faint scrapes or the softest thud from above, always enough to make my heart skip. One evening, I decided I needed to understand what had happened. I climbed the attic stairs, lantern in hand, and stood before the hatch. My palms were clammy, and I had to force myself to breathe slowly. With trembling fingers, I lifted the cover and shone the light inside. The loft was empty, just as the police had said. But something caught my eye. A faint trail of soot along the beams, barely visible in the lantern's glow. Someone had moved carefully, deliberately, leaving just enough trace to know they'd been there. Over the next few weeks, I pieced together what must have happened. The intruder had been small, agile, probably living off scraps while slipping in and out without ever being seen. I imagined nights when they must have hidden, listening to me as I read or did homework, just a shadow above my head. The thought made my skin crawl. Yet, amid the fear, I began to feel a strange respect for their ingenuity. They had survived in that attic in silence, in darkness, unnoticed. It wasn't long before I realized that the cottage had changed me. The way I moved through the rooms, the way I listened to the wind, even the way I approached strangers, everything felt sharper, more cautious. But I also learned something vital. Fear could teach vigilance, and the smallest details often mattered the most. One misty afternoon, I climbed to the attic again, this time deliberately examining every beam and rafter. The cottage groaned beneath me. The wind rattled the windows, and I imagined the eyes that had once watched me. I didn't see anyone, but the memory of that pale hand remained vivid in my mind. It was a reminder that the world had shadows, that even the familiar could hide secrets. And sometimes the things that scare us the most aren't monsters. They're people, surviving in ways we can't fully understand. By the time November rolled in, the fog had thickened over the moors, and the nights grew longer, darker. The cottage no longer felt like a home in the way it once had. Every corner, every shadow seemed to carry memory, the echo of that intruder who had once shared our attic. My parents, still shaken from the ordeal, tried to reassure me, but the tension in the house was palpable. I found myself waking up at odd hours, heart pounding at the faintest sound. The patter of rain, the creak of the floorboards, even the distant bray of a sheep. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the grain in the worn wood, trying to focus on homework, when I noticed the back door ajar. Not wide open, just slightly, like a gap between the latch and the frame. My stomach tightened. I knew I had locked it before dinner. Slowly, I approached, my bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. The door didn't move when I nudged it, but the subtle imprint of muddy footprints led toward the side of the house, toward the small shed where my father kept firewood. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The mist was thick, clinging to my jacket and hair. I followed the footprints, each step more tentative than the last. They ended abruptly at the shed. No one was there, only the fallen leaves, the rusted hinges, and the faint smell of smoke. Someone had been here recently. My mind raced. Could the intruder have returned? I spent that night wide awake, listening for any sign, any movement. The fire flickered low in the fireplace, and the wind howled through the chimney. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I slept in the sitting room with the lantern at my side. In the morning, my parents found me curled up in the chair, pale and wide-eyed. I tried to explain, but they insisted it was just my imagination running wild. Days passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak, every gust of wind seemed deliberate, intentional. I became hyper-aware, noticing the tiniest disturbances, a displaced book, a chair slightly askew, a shadow that lingered longer than it should. And yet the fear was mingled with curiosity. I wanted to know who had been in our attic, why they had come, and how they had survived unnoticed. One night, weeks later, I decided to face the fear directly. I set up a small surveillance corner in the sitting room, lanterns, notebooks, and a borrowed camera from school. I wanted to record anything unusual to finally prove to myself, and maybe to the police, that someone had been here. Hours passed, the mist outside thickening, the rain drumming relentlessly. And then, at precisely 2:13 a.m., a faint noise, a shuffle, rose from above. My heart pounded as I crept up the stairs, lantern in hand, feeling the boards tremble beneath my weight. At the attic hatch, I paused, listening. A whisper of movement, deliberate and soft. I held my breath and slowly pushed the cover open. Nothing. Just the shadows, the familiar darkness. I shone the light across the beams. That's when I noticed something odd. A small bundle, hidden behind a loose rafter. I reached in cautiously and pulled out a tattered journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting. I sat cross-legged on the floor reading by the lantern's glow. The journal belonged to a boy named Thomas, roughly my age, who had been living in the loft for months. He wrote about being homeless, escaping abuse, finding the cottage abandoned during the day and surviving on scraps from nearby farms. He described his fear, his hunger, but also a strange joy in his small victories, slipping past the villagers, finding warmth in the loft and occasionally watching someone like me, not with malice but with longing for human connection. It was unsettling and humbling. The hand I had seen, the footprints in the mud, the soot-streaked lantern, all of it made sense now. Thomas hadn't been a threat. He had been a boy, like me, trying to survive, unseen. And yet, the experience had changed both of us in ways neither of us could fully comprehend. I eventually returned the journal to the police, along with a detailed account of what I had found. Officers scoured the surrounding area, finding signs that Thomas had moved on, likely placed in the care of social services or a distant relative. My parents, though wary, began letting me reclaim my home, piece by piece, and the cottage slowly returned to normal. Yet, the incident left an indelible mark. I learned that fear often distorts reality, that our first impressions, like a pale hand in the dark, can be misleading. I learned empathy too in the most unexpected way, that behind the shadows and the sounds that frightened me was another human being, struggling just like me, unseen and unheard. The attic, once a place of terror, became a reminder that courage isn't just about facing monsters, it's about understanding them. Even now, years later, when I hear a creak above or a shadow passes the corner of my eye, I pause, but I don't feel the same dread. I feel awareness, a quiet respect for the lives that intersect with ours in ways we rarely notice. The cottage taught me vigilance, empathy, and patience. It taught me that fear can coexist with understanding, and that the stories hidden in silence are often the ones worth listening to the most. Morale: fear often comes from misunderstanding, and courage is not just about confronting danger. It's about seeing the humanity in the unknown, listening before judging, and allowing empathy to guide our actions. I never expected life in Vancouver to feel so isolating. At 23, I'd been uprooted from everything familiar: a small, noisy apartment in Seattle, the coffee shop where everyone knew my name, the weekend hikes in the Cascades, and dumped into a high-rise that scraped clouds and carried the constant hum of downtown traffic. My new job was exciting, no doubt, but the thrill of a promotion was tempered by the hollow echo of an empty apartment. I thought I could handle it, but the walls, the tall windows, and the reflective surfaces seemed to watch me as much as I watched them. It was a damp March evening, the kind that leaves your hair frizzed and your coat soaked through before you even step inside. I was trying to unpack the last of my boxes, juggling clothes and dishes, when I propped my phone against a stack of books for a video call with Ryan. He'd stayed behind in Seattle, and long distance was never easy, but it was comforting to see a familiar face as I unpacked a life that felt more like a cardboard box than a home. The city lights twinkled like distant stars beyond my window. Rain slid down the glass in thin, winding streams. And that's when I saw it, my reflection in the window rippling oddly, like the glass was alive. I leaned closer to my phone screen, laughing at myself for imagining it, when Ryan froze mid-sentence, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Amelia, someone's in the room." The words hit me harder than the wind rattling the window. My pulse jumped. I spun toward the mirrored closet doors, the hallway lights reflecting faintly on their surface. One door shivered, a narrow gap appearing along the seam. My stomach turned over. A pale hand withdrew from the slit, vanishing as if it had never existed. My scream caught in my throat. I bolted, heart hammering, and slammed the apartment door behind me. I ran 12 flights down to the lobby, drenched, shaking, and yelling for the night concierge. Security swept the apartment. Windows were locked, deadbolts untouched, closet empty. except for the faint, wet outline of a handprint on the mirrored door, dissolving like it had never been real. No forced entry, no tool marks. Police suggested it might have been a trick of light or an old print. I wanted to believe them. I tried to. But something deep inside refused to let me forget. I didn't sleep well for weeks. Every creak in the building sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like a hand pressed against glass. I moved boxes to block the mirrored doors, but I couldn't unpack anything else in that corner. Even daylight didn't help. Reflections in polished surfaces set me on edge, and I found myself avoiding elevators with mirrored walls. Work became a blur. I threw myself into projects, hoping distraction would soothe the unease. Ryan's calls helped, his calm voice a tether to sanity, though I sometimes caught myself freezing mid-conversation, staring at a window or a glass door, expecting to see that same fleeting hand. 2 weeks after the incident, I decided to go back and collect the last of my belongings before breaking the lease. My apartment had never felt like home, but leaving it was harder than I expected. I unlocked the door, and the familiar smell of dust and rain hit me. The place looked smaller now, tighter, haunted by memory. I moved through the rooms quickly, stuffing clothes into bags, trying not to glance at mirrors. That's when I noticed it. A small white business card slipped under the door. Curious, I picked it up. Window cleaning service, it read. No company name, no number, no website. Just a vague, impersonal invitation. I checked online. Nothing. The address didn't exist. My chest tightened. My mind raced through rational explanations, but nothing made sense. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a leftover from movers. It felt deliberate, personal, designed to remind me of that night. I left the apartment for the last time with a shiver crawling down my spine. The city lights blurred through my wet hair as I walked toward the elevator, clutching my bags. Even years later, I can't pass a reflective window without my pulse picking up, my mind flashing back to that pale hand retreating at the last possible second. The memory lingers, stubborn and unyielding, like the echo of a scream that never fully left the hallway. Even after I moved out, the memory of that night clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I rented a smaller apartment in a quieter neighborhood, far from the reflective glass towers of downtown. The walls were painted a soft beige, the floorboards creaked in a familiar way, and there were no mirrored closets to haunt my peripheral vision. Still, the city lights, once comforting, now seemed like distant eyes, glinting and observing. Work continued to demand my attention. I found myself staying late, often wandering the office floors after hours, a little too aware of the way the fluorescent lights glared off polished surfaces. Ryan tried to convince me that my fear was natural after trauma. "You saw a handprint, Amelia," he said gently during one late-night call. "But you weren't harmed. Maybe it's just your mind replaying the fear." I wanted to believe him. I tried to. But when I walked past a glass conference room where the reflective windows in the elevator, my body reacted before my brain could catch up. One Friday evening, after a long day of meetings and client calls, I stayed late to finish a report. The office was empty, and my own reflection stared back from the darkened windows with an unsettling familiarity. I almost laughed at myself for feeling paranoid, until movement caught my eye. Something flickering behind my reflection. My pulse hit my throat, and I realized in a cold, sinking moment that it was just a shadow from the street below. My heart slowed, but the echo of fear lingered. That night, I decided I needed to confront it, to reclaim control. I researched the psychology of trauma and urban legends surrounding high-rise apartments. I even installed motion-sensitive lights in my new apartment and kept a small camera trained on reflective surfaces, more for reassurance than anything else. Each time I watched the footage and saw only an empty room, I felt a small victory. Slowly, I learned to distinguish fear from reality, though the lessons came in uneasy increments. Months later, a new job assignment sent me back downtown for a client meeting. I walked past the building where it all had happened. The glass facade gleamed in the morning sun, innocuous, ordinary. My stomach twisted, memories resurfacing like a tide. I paused for a moment, and I swear I saw a fleeting flicker in the mirrored windows. It could have been a reflection of a passerby, a cloud shifting in the sky. But my fingers itched for reassurance, my instincts taut with unease. I reminded myself of everything I'd learned. Trauma can warp perception, the mind clinging to moments of fear long after danger has passed. The handprint, the trembling closet door, the strange card. These were anomalies, yes, but they were also proof of my vulnerability. They reminded me that being alone, even in a safe, modern environment, comes with its own hazards, a heightened sense of danger, a fragile trust in perception. That afternoon, after my meeting, I allowed myself a slow, deliberate walk around the block. I observed my reflection in storefront windows and street glass, taking deliberate breaths, practicing calm. Nothing moved unexpectedly. Nothing reached for me. And in that moment, I realized the city wasn't out to get me. My fear had been both real and imagined, a reminder that vigilance is necessary but obsession is dangerous. Years passed. I moved again, this time to a leafy suburb where I could see the horizon, not just endless steel and glass. My relationship with Ryan grew stronger. His presence was a steadying anchor through residual anxiety. I no longer check windows obsessively. I can walk past mirrored surfaces without my pulse spiking. But sometimes, when the sun sets over a high-rise downtown, I pause, just long enough to remember the hand, the card. The night that taught me fear is a teacher as much as it is a warning. I don't dwell on it anymore, but I never forget the lesson. Fear is real, but it doesn't always mean danger. The mind can exaggerate shadows and reflections, creating monsters that exist only in memory and imagination. What matters is how you respond, through awareness, preparation, and courage, even when the rational mind knows you're safe. That night in the apartment could have left me paralyzed, but instead, it taught me resilience. Sometimes I still see my reflection ripple in the corner of my eye. I pause, breathe, and continue walking. I've learned that shadows can be illusions, that glass can distort reality, but vigilance, self-trust, and a measured response can reclaim peace. Life is full of unexpected moments, and while some of them may unsettle you, facing them allows growth rather than fear to shape your story. Moral lesson: fear is a signal, not a sentence. Confronting it with awareness and courage transforms anxiety into strength, teaching us to differentiate real danger from imagined shadows while reclaiming control over our lives. The first time I set foot in my aunt's cottage near Loch Shiel, I felt the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of waiting. I was 21, fresh out of college, and thought I could handle a weekend alone in the Highlands, keeping the place warm while Aunt Margaret visited friends in Inverness. "Just you, the wind, and the peat fire," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "And don't let the sheep escape." I smiled, thinking it charming. By the time I drove up the winding, fog-laden road, my car's headlights barely touched the slick stone walls of the cottage. The wind was already a presence, tugging at my coat and rattling the old shutters. Inside, the cottage smelled of wood smoke and mothballs. I ran my fingers along the familiar grooves of the furniture, polished oak, worn from decades of care, and felt a sense of nostalgia mixed with unease. There was a comfort here, yes, but also the undeniable hum of isolation. I unpacked a few essentials, stoked the fire, and brewed a mug of tea strong enough to wake the dead. Outside, the pines bent under the storm that had rolled in, their branches moaning like an old choir. By 10 o'clock, the wind was insistent, and I had taken refuge near the fire, the mug warming my hands. Then it started. The garden light, motion activated and perched above the gate, flicked on. Then off. Then on again. Each burst of white glare was precise, almost deliberate. At first, I blamed the storm, imagining shadows dancing with gusts of wind. But then the flashes followed a pattern. 3 quick, a pause, then 2 slow. My stomach clenched. I grabbed my aunt's wool coat and tiptoed to the window, heart thundering. Beyond the birch trees, beyond the stone wall, a figure stood motionless, the kind of stillness that feels deliberate. I swallowed, fingers tightening around the coat. The shotgun hung above the fireplace, heavy and familiar from childhood visits. I didn't hesitate. I brought it down, chambered it, and crouched near the kitchen counter, reaching for the phone to call the local constable. The line crackled once, twice, then silence. The storm had severed it. The light clicked on again. The figure was gone. I stayed crouched, ears straining for any sound other than the wind, counting breaths in the cold, peaty air. Every time the door latch rattled, I flinched, imagining the worst. Hours stretched into a taut, unbearable vigil, until finally, the first gray light of dawn seeped across the hills. Exhausted, shaking, I dared to stand and peer through the window. The garden was empty, only footprints in the soft earth giving testament to the night's intruder. Each pair was perfectly spaced, circling the cottage and stopping beneath my bedroom window. When Aunt Margaret returned that morning, I tried to put on a normal face. "Did you enjoy the solitude?" she asked cheerfully, oblivious to the tension still clinging to me. I nodded, murmuring something about the storm being wild. Together we walked around the cottage, following the footprints she now noticed. Her brow furrowed. "Well, that's odd," she said. "Looks deliberate." I didn't tell her how frozen I had felt the night before, the way I had imagined a shadow moving just outside my door, testing me. The constable, a gruff man with a kind heart, came over later. He examined the prints, nodding slowly. "You're not the first," he said. "Several cottages in the glen reported the same thing last night. Light patterns, footprints, but nothing taken, nothing broken. Whoever or whatever is doing this, they're careful." I wanted to ask more questions, but my throat was dry, my nerves frayed. "Do you think they're watching us?" I asked. He shrugged, not offering more than a grim smile. "Perhaps, perhaps not." That day, every small sound, the clatter of a teacup, the howl of the wind, made me jump. I kept the windows shuttered, the doors locked, and the fire burning. My mind replayed the night endlessly, the flashes of light, the stillness of the figure, the way the storm had cut off communication. I thought about the footprints, the careful spacing, the circle around the cottage that had stopped directly beneath my bedroom window. It was as if they had been waiting for me to wake. By evening, exhaustion had forced me into a wary sleep, haunted by dreams of glowing eyes in the garden and the tapping of invisible fingers against the window pane. The next day I explored the woods beyond the cottage, hoping for some rational explanation. Nothing. No trace of the figure, no footprints beyond those in my yard. Only the wind, the peat, and the endless green of the Highlands. I realized something then. Isolation magnifies fear. It stretches it, shapes it, and sometimes it doesn't matter if the threat is real or imagined. The mind becomes a lens, capturing every flicker of light, every branch that bends, every shadow that shifts in the corner of your eye. And yet, I also felt a strange exhilaration, survival against something unseen, testing not just my courage but my composure. By the time my aunt left again a week later, I had started to sense a rhythm to the Highlands, a hidden pulse beneath the wind and rain. The footprints and light signals remained a mystery, but they had taught me something I could not ignore. Vigilance is as much about calm as it is about alertness, and courage is often measured in moments when no one is watching. Weeks passed, and yet I couldn't shake the memory of that night. Returning home to the city felt almost like a reprieve, but even in the bustle of people and traffic, my mind replayed the Highland storm. Every flicker of a porch light, every shadow behind a curtain made my skin tighten. I tried to convince myself that it was a one-time incident, a prank perhaps, or the imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That figure had a purpose. That pattern of flashes had intent. Several months later, I received a letter from Aunt Margaret. She had been visiting Inverness again and mentioned a meeting with local neighbors. Strange things still happen at the cottages, she wrote. I reread the words several times, each repetition tightening the knot in my chest. I realized then that I had been drawn into something larger, something rooted not in coincidence but in pattern. She included a map, carefully marking cottages that had reported the same eerie signals. I studied it, tracing the tiny roads and locks with my finger, feeling a mix of fascination and fear. Unable to resist, I found myself planning a return trip. I convinced a friend to come with me, hoping that companionship would dull the lingering terror. We drove through winding roads and thick fog, the landscape almost too beautiful for words, locks reflecting gray skies, hillsides blanketed with gorse and pine, and the occasional stone cottage, silent and watchful. I wondered whether the figure would appear again, and whether it had been waiting all this time for someone else to stumble into its careful pattern. That night the storm came again, just like before. My friend insisted we stay near the fire, muttering jokes about ghosts and Highland spirits. I couldn't smile. The garden light blinked. On, off, on again. 3 quick flashes, a pause, too slow. My heart lurched. My friend noticed my sudden stillness. "What?" she asked. I just shook my head. "Nothing," I said, though my voice trembled. The figure appeared beyond the birch trees, unmoving, deliberate. I felt my pulse hammering. My hands gripped the shotgun instinctively. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it vanished. No footprints this time. No sound. Only the light, still blinking in its peculiar rhythm. My friend finally noticed, her wide eyes mirroring my own fear. She whispered, "We need to leave." But I stayed frozen, mesmerized, trying to understand the intention behind the quiet watchfulness of that night. The following morning, the aftermath was less tangible than before. There were no footprints, no signs of intrusion, only the lingering dread that something had observed us, tested us, and left. I realized that the figure wasn't trying to harm. It was deliberate, patient, almost like a sentinel. And in that realization, my fear transformed into a strange respect. I had been confronted not with malice, but with a challenge. We spent the day walking the surrounding glen, retracing the previous patterns noted on Aunt Margaret's map. I tried to reason it out, to find some logical explanation. Perhaps a local recluse, perhaps someone experimenting with lights, or maybe just an old Highland superstition brought to life. Every stone, every tree seemed to hold the possibility of a clue. I began to see how small details, the spacing of footprints, the timing of the flashes, the silent observation, could be interpreted as testing awareness, patience, and composure. By the end of the day, I had stopped trying to rationalize entirely. Instead, I accepted that some mysteries in life were not meant to be solved, only experienced. I felt a new kind of courage, the sort that isn't loud or dramatic but quiet and enduring. The Highlands had a rhythm, a pulse, a way of testing those who dared to be alone in its vastness. I had been tested, and in surviving, I had learned something essential about my own strength. That night I slept near the fire, keeping one eye occasionally on the blinking garden light. It remained dark, and I allowed myself a small, private sense of triumph. Fear had been a teacher, vigilance a companion, and calm the only way to survive the night. Years later, I still remember that weekend as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. Every time a porch light flickers, or shadows sway just out of reach, I am transported back to the storm, the figure, and the circle of footprints beneath my window. I don't sleep as deeply when I see the light, not because I am afraid of being harmed, but because I remember being tested and passing. The moral of that experience became clear. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it with composure. Awareness and patience can be as protective as any weapon, and respect for the unknown is sometimes the only way to survive it. That night by Lochshiel taught me to trust my instincts, to observe patterns carefully, and to understand that some forces, though mysterious, can strengthen rather than destroy. I have returned to the Highlands many times since, but I never again approached the cottages as naively as I did at 21. The figure, the lights, the footprints, they remain a reminder that the world holds mysteries beyond explanation, and that sometimes the greatest lesson is the one that challenges your courage in silence, without fanfare or answer. And so, I live with a quiet vigilance, a respect for the unseen, and the understanding that fear, when faced with calm and clarity, becomes not a prison, but a guide. Moral lesson. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to face it calmly and wisely. Respect for the unknown can teach resilience, awareness, and inner strength. The weekend had arrived with the sort of oppressive gray that makes the Lake District feel like a place suspended between rain and shadow. I'd been looking forward to a quiet few days alone in my parents' glass-fronted lakeside lodge, imagining the kind of freedom that comes when the only interruptions are the ripple of water and the call of distant birds. At 20, I had lived enough weekends in this lodge to know its moods, the way the mist coils over the water in the mornings, how shadows gather around the pine trees like quiet spectators. But that weekend, September's damp chill felt different, heavier somehow, as if the clouds themselves were warning me. I arrived late Friday afternoon, hauling my duffel bag through the narrow gravel drive. The lodge was deserted, silent except for the occasional creak of weathered timber. I set my headphones on, played some jazz, and sank into the leather armchair by the fireplace. Rain tapped insistently against the windows and the smell of wet pine drifted inside. For hours I let myself drift, half listening to music, half watching the lake swallow the sunset. Everything seemed ordinary, mundane even, and yet the world outside had a tension I couldn't name. Around 11:30, when the wind picked up and the rain hissed against the panes, a sharp knock shattered the quiet. I froze, music still thrumming in my ears, heart suddenly alert. Another knock didn't come, only the low, constant hiss of water. I peeled off my headphones and listened carefully. The knock had been deliberate, too deliberate for a falling branch or some accident of the weather. My stomach turned. Curiosity edged with fear pushed me toward the porch. I opened the door. Nothing but slick boards and rain-soaked gravel. Whoever had knocked had vanished. I was about to shrug it off when I caught a faint crunch from the rear of the house. My pulse jumped. I crept to the kitchen windows, wet pine scent clinging to my jacket, and saw him, a tall, bald man in a long, dark coat stepping onto the deck. He paused, head tilting like he was scanning for movement inside. Then, as if confirming I was alone, he tried the patio door handle. My heart thudded in my chest. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and bolted upstairs, whispering to the 999 operator about the intruder while barricading myself in the bathroom. I didn't dare breathe as the minutes stretched. The wood beneath my feet creaked, and then came the crash of glass breaking. My stomach sank. Footsteps pounded across the kitchen floor, then up the staircase. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the sink, trying to calm my voice for the operator. "Please hurry," I whispered. Each slam on the bathroom door rattled the hinges, and I imagined the man's shadow flickering beneath the frosted glass panel. Then, sirens, distant but approaching, slicing through the rain's hiss. The pounding stopped. Silence. Only the dripping water and my ragged breathing filled the air. When the officers arrived, they found him hiding behind a tool shed, a rusted tire iron clutched in his hand. He offered no explanation, no motive. Nothing had been stolen. I felt relief, of course, but it was the hollow, shaken kind that doesn't leave easily. That night I couldn't sleep on the ground floor, and for months afterward, every sudden knock or creak of timber made me jump. I realized then, danger doesn't always announce itself, and sometimes it comes simply because you are alone when someone decides to strike. The next morning, I wandered the lodge trying to piece together the fragments of fear I'd felt. Police had taken photographs, dusted for prints, and reassured me it was likely opportunistic. But knowing someone had breached my sanctuary, my parents' home, my retreat, left an indelible mark. I examined the broken glass, traced the lines of the splintered frame, and couldn't help but feel small in a world where someone else's intention could ripple so violently into mine. By Sunday, I forced myself to sit by the fire again, listening to music through headphones. My hands no longer shook, and I could breathe without thinking about what might be outside. But every so often, I would glance at the back door, half expecting him to appear. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Being safe is often as much about vigilance and preparation as it is about luck. The next week passed in a haze. Back at university, I couldn't focus. Even mundane things, the chatter of classmates, the hum of fluorescent lights, felt too loud, too intrusive. I kept replaying the intruder's cold, bald stare, the way he had tilted his head like he was reading my thoughts. The police had told me it was probably a one-off, a thrill-seeker or a burglar with poor judgment. But rational explanations did little to calm the tight knot in my stomach. My parents tried to reassure me over the phone, their voices warm and steady, but I could hear the worry underneath. By the following weekend, I felt a restless need to reclaim the lodge. I drove back, the narrow country roads slick with September rain, the hills shrouded in mist. The lodge stood there, serene and almost mocking in its quiet. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, half expecting shadows to move in the corners. Nothing stirred. I switched on the lights, checked the windows and doors, and allowed myself a small, shaky laugh. Perhaps confronting the place head-on was the only way to wrest control from the memory of that night. That evening, I cooked a simple dinner and settled by the fire. Rain tapped gently against the glass, a lullaby that felt almost soothing. I tried to lose myself in a book, but my thoughts wandered. What if he returned? What if this wasn't an isolated incident? I shook my head. Paranoia would only give the intruder more power. I resolved to take practical steps, lock every door, install an alarm, and keep my phone nearby. The logic helped, but the unease lingered. Around 10, I heard a faint knock. My heart leapt, but I forced myself to listen carefully. This time it was different. Lighter, more hesitant. I peeked through the blinds. A neighbor carrying a basket of fresh eggs smiled awkwardly and waved. "Thought you might like a few for breakfast," she said. I felt a wave of relief and gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it reminded me that the world wasn't only shadows and fear. Not every knock heralded danger. The following months involved subtle changes. I installed better locks, reinforced the patio door, and even set up a small security camera facing the deck. I still visited the lodge alone, sometimes bringing a friend for company, sometimes relishing the solitude. But now I approached it with caution rather than naive comfort. I noticed details I'd once ignored. The way the mist rolled across the lake in early mornings, the subtle creak of the floorboards in response to the wind. The lodge wasn't just a building. It was a place alive with the potential for beauty and danger alike. One Sunday, while organizing the shed, I found a rusted tire iron hidden beneath a pile of old garden tools. I froze, remembering the intruder and his silent menace. My hand trembled slightly, but I forced myself to breathe. I realized that fear could either control me or teach me. I decided then that my response would be preparation and mindfulness, not panic. The intruder had left no explanation, no personal vendetta. He had merely chosen a target. Understanding that randomness didn't mean inevitability was a lesson I carried forward. By late autumn, I began inviting friends over more often. Dinner parties by the fire, quiet evenings watching rain streak down the glass walls, laughter echoing through the lodge. These were my reclamation of the space. Each night, I went to bed knowing the world could be unpredictable. But that courage was not the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. The lodge, once a symbol of vulnerability, had become a testament to resilience. The final chapter came unexpectedly. My parents returned from a weekend in Keswick, curious about the changes I had made. We sat together, watching the mist curl over the lake. I told them everything, The fear, the police, the long nights staring at shadows. My father nodded thoughtfully. "It's not just about locks and alarms," he said quietly. "It's about knowing yourself, knowing what scares you, and deciding how you're going to meet it." My mother added, "And sometimes just taking small steps forward is enough." I realized then that fear was not weakness, it was information. It told me where boundaries existed, what I valued, and how I could act to protect both. The intruder had never taken anything from me, yet he had given me something unexpected: clarity. Life, I understood, was unpredictable, and danger didn't always announce itself. But courage, vigilance, and preparation could carve a space of safety within that unpredictability. As I stood by the lake one crisp evening, the wind carrying the scent of pine and rain, I felt a quiet pride. The lodge was mine, not because I owned it, but because I had faced my fear and learned from it. Danger may visit, but it doesn't have to dominate. The moral was simple yet profound. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the strength to face it, prepare for it, and live fully despite it. The story ends with Ethan's hard-won resilience, showing that even random threats can teach lessons about vigilance, courage, and self-awareness. I never thought a quiet night in our pale blue bungalow could feel so alive. I guess that's the thing about fear. It has a way of making every creak, every shadow, and every gust of wind feel monumental. My name's Luca Thompson. I was 10 years old when my parents left me alone for the first time late one autumn night in Wellington. They had to pick up my sister, Emily, from some school event, and I remember their last words as they stepped into the car. "Don't open the door for anyone, stay put. We'll be back in a bit." They drove off, headlights cutting through the fog rolling in from Cook Strait, and suddenly, the house felt big. Too big. I settled on the couch, the handheld game console in my lap, the screen illuminating my face in the dim living room. The wind rattled the eaves above, and I tried to lose myself in pixelated worlds of adventure, my fingers twitching across buttons faster than my heart could beat. The house moaned around me as though it were a living creature stretching and settling for the night. I told myself it was just the wind, that everything was normal. But then I heard it, a faint scratching. It was so soft, I almost convinced myself it was the wind again. No, this was different. I paused my game and held my breath. The sound came again, slower this time, deliberate, directly above the hallway. Nails scraping wood. My stomach dropped, cold and heavy. I wanted to run, scream, or pretend it wasn't happening, but curiosity and fear tangled inside me like a rope around my chest. I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept toward the hallway. The ceiling hatch leading to the roof crawl space stared down at me. I shined the beam upward. The panel trembled once, a subtle vibration that sent a shiver racing through my spine. And then I saw it. A grimy hand, the sleeve of a frayed red sweater, curling around the edge and slowly pushing the hatch aside. I froze. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs felt glued to the carpet. My chest heaved as my heart hammered in my ears. The hand disappeared, the panel shifting slightly as if testing the air. I darted back toward my bedroom, breath ragged, flashlight bouncing across the walls, every shadow a potential threat. Sliding under my bed, I fumbled for my phone and dialed emergency services, whispering my address through trembling lips. The footsteps came next, heavy, deliberate, pacing the hallway outside my door. My stomach knotted, every step of his boots sounding like a drum signaling my doom. I could hear him pausing outside each door, maybe listening, maybe just enjoying the fear he had conjured. Minutes passed like hours. I clutched the phone, listening to the operator's calm voice, trying to steady my racing pulse. Then, like an angel appearing out of nowhere, the headlights of my parents' car swept across the living room curtains. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. When the police arrived, they found the hatch wide open. Inside the crawl space, there was a sleeping bag, half-eaten food packets, and a portable radio that was still warm to the touch. Whoever had been in our house had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. I never understood why he never looked under the bed. But from that night on, my understanding of fear, caution, and instinct would forever change. The following morning, the sun seemed almost too bright, mocking the terror of the night before. Mom and Dad kept their voices low, talking to the police, while Emily, oblivious to the danger, chattered about her school event. I stayed in my room, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was safe. My parents had assured me everything was fine, but every creak in the floorboards and every gust of wind reminded me otherwise. The officers explained that the man had likely been living in the crawl space for some time. Old food wrappers, a makeshift bed, and a battery-powered radio indicated he had been coming and going quietly, almost like a ghost. They asked if I had seen him face to face, but I could only shake my head. The memory of that grimy hand still burned into my mind. I couldn't sleep that night. Every shadow seemed to crawl along the walls. Every flicker of light became a moving figure. I kept my phone by the bed, flashlight within reach, and the closet door slightly ajar in case I needed a quick escape. Mom tried to reassure me, but the fear had taken root deeper than her words could reach. School the next day was hard. I felt exposed, like everyone could see my terror radiating off me in waves. My friends laughed about Halloween pranks, but I couldn't joke. I had seen real danger, and it had looked at me from the ceiling. That day, I realized how fragile the bubble of safety we live in truly is. Homes feel secure, parents seem invincible, and yet, in an instant, everything can change. Over the next few weeks, my parents installed locks, sensors, and even extra lighting around the house. But the most profound change happened in me. I became more cautious, more aware. I noticed the sound of a floorboard squeaking, the shadow of a car moving past the window. I carried myself differently, not out of fear of strangers in general, but out of respect for the unpredictability of life. One afternoon, while helping Dad clean the garage, I asked him why the man had never found me. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and said, "Sometimes, Luca, it's luck. Sometimes it's instinct. And sometimes, it's just that people look where they expect to see, not where the truth is hiding." I thought about that a lot. I understood instinct, yes. But luck? That felt random, unfair. And yet, I couldn't deny it. My survival that night had been part instinct, part chance, all terrifying. Even years later, I jump at the creak of timbers overhead. Even years later, I sleep with one eye half open just in case. And even years later, I carry a lesson no classroom could teach: vigilance, respect for danger, and understanding that sometimes the world is far less predictable than you want it to be. The weeks after the incident were strange. Life seemed to resume its usual rhythm for everyone else. Mom and Dad went to work, Emily went to school, and I shuffled to class like nothing had happened. But for me, the bungalow felt different. Every room held a memory of that night. The hallway where the hatch trembled, the living room where shadows had danced, and my bedroom, the one place that had become both refuge and prison. I started keeping a journal, something I hadn't done before. I wrote down every sound, every movement, every instance of fear or relief. Writing was a way to process what happened, to give shape to the chaos in my mind. Sometimes I wrote my thoughts late at night, flashlight under the covers, imagining that if I captured it all on paper, I could make the fear smaller, manageable. Dad noticed the change in me and suggested I learn some basic self-defense. "It's not about fighting, Luca," he said. "It's about knowing what to do if something goes wrong." So, after school, I started training. Simple moves, basic awareness techniques, even how to spot exits and stay calm. Part of me felt embarrassed, 10 years old, learning to throw a punch, but another part felt powerful. I was reclaiming my fear, learning to own it instead of letting it own me. One rainy evening, I was practicing footwork in the garage when I noticed the shadows shifting on the walls in an unusual way. My pulse spiked, my instincts kicking in, and I froze. The garage door rattled. I reached for the flashlight and swung it toward the corner. Nothing. Just the wind. My hands shook, adrenaline still surging. But I realized something. The fear hadn't disappeared, but I had started controlling it. I wasn't paralyzed anymore. I was alert. I was aware. Mom watched quietly from the doorway, her expression soft but concerned. "It's good to be cautious," she said, "but don't let fear become your life." Her words sank in. I didn't want fear controlling me. I wanted to be ready, yes, but I also wanted to live. The intruder had changed me, yes, but he hadn't broken me. By the time Emily came home one afternoon with a school project about local history, I had started noticing things about our neighborhood I'd never seen before. Which houses had lights left on, which streets were quieter at night, even which neighbors seemed to watch for strangers. Awareness became part of my daily routine, not paranoia, just vigilance. Life was fragile, I realized, but understanding that fragility made me stronger. One night, months after the break-in, I woke to a soft tapping on the window. My heart leapt and I froze, flashlight in hand. The trees outside swayed with the wind, rain lashing against the glass. For a moment I imagined the intruder had returned. My pulse raced, muscles tense. I peeked through the curtain and saw a small wet cat trying to squeeze through a crack in the screen. Relief washed over me, but the reaction stayed. The vigilance, the readiness. I began noticing other things too. People's habits, sounds, even my own reactions. I could sense when something was off, when a neighbor walked a path they didn't usually take, or when a car lingered too long near our house. I learned that danger rarely announces itself loudly. It creeps, it whispers, and if you pay attention, you have a chance. School life continued, and I became quieter, more observant. Friends would ask why I didn't laugh at certain jokes or why I always noticed little things. I'd shrug, not wanting to explain the night that changed me forever. Fear had taught me vigilance, but it had also taught me empathy. I understood what it meant to feel small and helpless, to sense danger and not be able to act. One afternoon, Dad asked me to help him carry boxes from the garage. As we worked, he handed me a flashlight and said, "You see, Luca, knowledge is power. Being prepared doesn't mean you're scared, it means you're aware." I nodded. I understood now. I couldn't control everything, but I could control my response. I could respect danger without being ruled by it. Years later, I still live in that pale blue bungalow. The wind still howls off Cook Strait, the eaves still groan at night, and sometimes I hear the faint creak of floorboards that remind me of that night. But fear has changed into respect, vigilance, and a deeper understanding of life's unpredictability. I still check locks, keep a flashlight by my bed, and teach myself to notice the small details. The intruder never returned, and I never learned his identity. But I did learn something valuable. Life is fragile, and sometimes survival comes down to a mixture of instinct, preparedness, and yes, luck. I share my experience with younger kids in the neighborhood, teaching them about safety, awareness, and the importance of trusting their instincts. Most importantly, I learned a moral lesson I carry with me. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act wisely in spite of it. Fear can be paralyzing, but awareness, preparation, and presence of mind are tools we can use to navigate life safely. That night in the bungalow could have been a nightmare that haunted me forever. Instead, it became a lesson. Every creak of timber, every shadow on the wall reminds me to respect the unknown, to act thoughtfully, and to never underestimate the power of vigilance. Sometimes the smallest decisions, where to hide, when to move, how to breathe, can make the difference between danger and survival. And that is a lesson I carry every single day. Moral lesson: courage isn't the absence of fear, it's awareness, preparedness, and the choice to act wisely when confronted with danger.